For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the bombs have stopped falling on Iran. And instead of relief, instead of quiet, what's coming out of Tehran right now is something closer to a taunt. Iran's foreign ministry says the United States is, in its own words, stuck and struggling, trapped in a war it cannot find a way out of, and warns that Washington will inevitably pay the price. That alone would be a significant story on its own. But in the same breath, in the same 48 hours, Iran has opened up an entirely new front in this war, one that has nothing to do with the Strait of Hormuz or American bombers, and everything to do with a country more than 1,000 kilometers away that most people never expected to see pulled into this conflict at all: Ukraine. Let's start with what just happened on the American side of this, because it's the piece that's actually shifted, even if only for now. After close to 2 weeks of sustained nightly airstrikes against Iranian territory, the United States has paused its bombing campaign. President Trump has signaled this pause is meant to give space for talks to progress, specifically around a potential deal over the Strait of Hormuz. Iran, for its part, has responded to that pause by halting its own retaliatory strikes across the Middle East, the first real, mutual quiet this war has seen since the ceasefire collapsed back on July the 6th. But mutual quiet is not the same as mutual trust, and Iran has made that distinction unmistakably clear. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson, Esmail Baghaei, stated plainly that the U.S. will not dictate the terms of how or when this war ends, framing the pause not as American mercy, but as American desperation, describing Washington as a country that started this war under Israeli influence and now finds itself unable to escape the disaster it created. Iran also said this week it is not currently engaging in peace talks with the United States at all, and that it will defend itself for as long as its interests require, language that suggests Tehran sees this pause as a tactical breathing room rather than the beginning of any real resolution. That posture, defiant, almost dismissive of American leverage, is the backdrop for the second, and in some ways more explosive, story unfolding right now. Because while the Middle Eastern front of this war has gone quiet for the moment, a completely different battlefield just opened up more than 1,000 kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory in the Caspian Sea. Here's what happened. On Saturday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky posted that Ukraine had achieved what he called very strong results with long-range strikes in the Caspian Sea, specifically naming vessels involved in transporting military cargo linked to Iran, along with a warship. Iran's own account of the incident describes an attack that caused an explosion aboard a commercial vessel, killing one sailor and injuring several others. A ship Iranian officials say was carrying iron ore from the Russian port of Astrakhan to the Iranian port of Enzali. Ukraine's own security services have offered a different characterization of the same event, identifying the targeted ships as two specific sanctioned cargo vessels, the Port Olya II and the Begi, which Kiev alleges were being used to move military logistics between Russia and Iran, not simply hauling iron ore as Tehran claims. Whichever version of events turns out to be more accurate, the reaction out of Iran has been immediate and sharp. Iran's foreign ministry summoned Ukraine's charge d'affaires in Tehran within hours, lodging what state media described as a strong protest over what Iran called a hostile and criminal act. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi went further, posting directly on social media that the strike, in his words, cannot go unanswered, and revealing that he had personally raised the incident in phone calls with both European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Notice who he called. Not just European diplomats managing the broader fallout, but Russia's own foreign minister, a signal of just how tightly Iran's response to this is being coordinated with Moscow, its wartime ally. And Araghchi didn't stop at diplomatic protest. He directly accused Israel of provoking the entire incident, claiming it was a deliberate attempt to drag Europe into what has, until now, been a Middle Eastern war. That's a serious allegation, one that reframes a Ukrainian strike, carried out over 1,000 kilometers from any Ukrainian front line, as part of a broader Israeli strategy to widen the conflict well beyond its original borders. Iran's Parliamentary National Security Commission chief, Ebrahim Azizi, added his own warning on social media, stating plainly that any attack on Iran always comes with a cost, and that the US and Israel are well aware of that fact, language clearly aimed at both Kiev and its Western backers simultaneously. Now, here's where this gets genuinely important beyond the immediate back and forth of accusations and protests, because analysts examining this incident are reading it as something much bigger than a single strike on a single ship. According to reporting from Fortune, speculation inside Tehran suggests Ukraine's strike may have been intended less as pure military necessity and more as a message, a demonstration that Iran's Caspian coastline, an area it has likely never had to seriously defend before, is now vulnerable and could become a bargaining chip in future negotiations with the United States. Azizi himself described what's forming as a ring of economic and military pressure closing in around Iran from multiple directions at once, pointing specifically to the American naval blockade already in place in the Indian Ocean, combined with this new exposure in the Caspian. And that ring keeps growing. This same week, Saudi Arabia has been conducting military strikes against Iran-backed Houthi targets in Yemen, retaliation for Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping. Put that together with the Caspian Sea strike, and with the ongoing standoff in the Strait of Hormuz, where Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy has claimed, in a telegram post, complete authority over the strait, forcing 6 ships to anchor after issuing warnings over just the past 24 hours, and you start to see a war that is no longer contained to a single front or even a single sea. It is a conflict now touching the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Caspian Sea simultaneously, 3 separate maritime choke points, 3 separate sets of allies and adversaries, all interconnected through Iran. There's an added wrinkle here, too, one that reveals just how tangled these overlapping wars have become. According to Kiev Post, the Trump administration has separately and directly warned Ukraine to refrain from striking non-Russian vessels following a string of Ukrainian drone attacks that disrupted oil operations linked to the American energy company Chevron, including strikes on tankers near the Russian Black Sea port of Novorossiysk, one of which was chartered by Chevron itself. That warning reportedly came after Chevron's own CEO met directly with senior U.S. officials to discuss protecting the company's operations in Kazakhstan. In other words, even as Iran is publicly warning Ukraine over the Caspian Sea strike, Washington itself has quietly been delivering a similar message to Kiev, worried about American commercial interests getting caught in the crossfire of a maritime campaign that keeps expanding into waters far from Ukraine's own borders. So, what happens next? Iran has explicitly reserved the right to take what its foreign ministry calls appropriate action to defend its national interests in response to the Caspian Sea strike, but has stopped short so far of detailing exactly what that response would look like. Fortune's reporting lays out some of the options analysts believe Tehran could pursue: direct retaliatory strikes against Ukraine, linked vessels and other waterways, attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure itself, or even a symbolic political move like formally recognizing Crimea and the Donbas as Russian territory. A gesture that would cost Iran little, but would further align it publicly with Moscow at a moment when Russia's own war in Ukraine grinds on in the background of everything else happening in the Middle East. Layer all of this together, and the picture that emerges is of a conflict that has stopped behaving like a contained 2-party war between Washington and Tehran, and started behaving like a genuinely global pressure system, with fronts opening in places nobody would have predicted just a few months ago. Iran, even while enjoying a rare pause in American airstrikes, is using this exact moment to project defiance rather than relief, telling the world it sees the United States as trapped, not triumphant. At the very same time, it's fending off an entirely new threat from a country that isn't even a direct party to its war with Washington, one capable of reaching Iranian vessels over 1,000 kilometers from its own borders. And it's doing all of this while Saudi Arabia batters Iran's regional proxies in Yemen, while its own navy claims total control over the Strait of Hormuz, and while American oil interests get tangled into the same maritime chaos from an entirely separate direction. This is a war that increasingly cannot be understood by watching just one map, one waterway, or one adversary at a time. Iran's defiant language toward Washington this week may sound like confidence. But confidence and encirclement can look remarkably similar from the outside, and right now, Tehran finds itself facing pressure from the Gulf, from the Red Sea, and now, unexpectedly, from the Caspian Sea as well, all at the exact same moment it's declaring that the United States is the one who's stuck. Whether that pause in American strikes holds long enough for real negotiations over Hormuz to actually take shape, or whether Iran's next move in the Caspian reignites hostilities from a direction nobody was watching closely enough, is the question hanging over the next several days. Keep an eye on all 3 fronts at once, because in this war, it's becoming clear that the next flashpoint rarely comes from the direction everyone expected.